We're going to go from the technical science into the less technical biblical studies, but I hope that I can give you some things that will deepen your understanding of why we believe that Genesis is teaching a literal six-day creation, a global flood, and a very recent history. We live in a world today where the church has a lot of different compromised positions. The gap theory, the day-gap day view. Don't know if you've heard of that one. That's where you have literal days, but a gap of millions of years between each of the days. There's the day-age view, that each of the days are millions of years. There's the view that Genesis 1 is mythology, just like the ancient Babylonians and Assyrians and Egyptians had creation myths and flood myths, so did the ancient Jews. And then there's the Promised Land view. One of my professors in Old Testament holds this view. He says that the Hebrew word for earth used in verse 1 of Genesis 1 is referring to the whole planet, but from then on in the rest of the chapter, the same Hebrew word he interprets as referring to the Promised Land, which he equates with the Garden of Eden. And it's a really clever argument, but seriously flawed. And then we have the framework hypothesis, which says that the days of that Genesis 1 is not really a historical account. It's a literary framework to teach theology and morality. And we'll look a little bit more at that later. Out of these different views of interpreting Genesis 1, and of course, we have the gap theory, or the local flood view, and the peaceful flood view, as well as the global flood view. Out of all of that, you develop three views of Earth history in the church today. The view that was almost universally believed by the church for 18 centuries is what we call the biblical young Earth creationist view. A supernatural creation week, SCW. About 6,000 years ago. Some young Earth creationists will push that creation date back to about 10,000 or 12,000 years. I appreciate them, but I disagree with them on that point. And then a global flood about 2,500 years before Christ, and then the rest of history up to the present time. That was the dominant view in church history for 18 centuries, almost the universal belief. It perished in the early 19th century, and by about the time of Darwin's book, virtually the whole church had accepted the millions of years. And it wasn't until the early 20th century that some Christians began to return to the young Earth view, and that has been growing in popularity within the church ever since. But two other dominant views in the church are the progressive creationist view. The progressive creationists reject Darwinian evolution, they reject biological evolution, but they accept astronomical and geological evolution. So they accept the Big Bang and the billions of years of cosmic and stellar evolution, and they accept the geological ages and the order of events in which creatures appear. The only thing that they insist on is that God supernaturally created the cosmic egg that became the Big Bang, and every so often over the course of those millions and billions of years, he supernaturally created the first forms of life, the first fish, the first amphibians, the first reptiles, but those creation events were separated by millions of years. The other view that is popular in the church is theistic evolution. And the theistic evolutionist accepts all three strands of evolution: cosmic evolution for explaining the universe, geological evolution for explaining the rock layers, and biological evolution for explaining the origin of living creatures. And so in the theistic evolutionist view, they would argue that the Bible teaches that God created, but science tells us how and when. And Francis Collins has been quoted several times in this conference, and he is a leading theistic evolutionist. So let's look at this question. I want to share some reasons why those last two views are wrong, and why we believe the Bible really is teaching the young earth creationist view. Before we look at the details, we first need to answer a very important question. And that is, we need to answer the question, what kind of genre of literature is Genesis 1 to 11? Anyone who's read the Bible very much at all will recognize that there are different kinds of literature in the Bible. There are parables. There are prophetic visions or dreams. There is historical narrative. In fact, about 2/3 of the Old Testament is historical narrative. About 1/3 of the New Testament is. There are epistles. And there are proverbs and poetry. So what is Genesis 1 to 11? Is that poetry? Is that mythology? Is that some kind of figurative text? Or is it historical narrative? There's a number of reasons for concluding that it is all historical narrative. First is to look at some of the characteristics of the text. And there are a number of reasons to conclude that this whole portion of Scripture, and especially Genesis 1, is narrative, historical narrative, just like Joshua, just like the book of Numbers, just like Judges and Ruth and Samuel and Kings. One is the sentence structure. When we look at Genesis 1, we have a very distinctive sentence structure. In the first verse, we have, in the beginning, God created. And the verb there is bara, which is translated created, and it is in the perfect verb form in Hebrew. And that is characteristic of the beginning of a narrative section. And then you have in verse 3, then God said in English, but in Hebrew it's then said God. The then is a translation in this case of a single letter in Hebrew. It's called the vav or the waw, depending on which Old Testament scholar you're talking to, but it's the same letter. And it's attached to the verb. And it is attached to a particular form of the verb called the imperfect verb form. And as you go through Genesis 1, you see at verse 3, imperfect verb attached to the vav, and that verbal form is called the vav consecutive. And so you have then God said, and was light, and saw God, and separated God, and called God, and so on. Right through the whole of Genesis 1, virtually every verse begins with this vav consecutive. You go into chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, all the way through Genesis. It's that vav consecutive. And that indicates the narrative, the continuation of the narrative account. The vav consecutive is almost never used in Hebrew poetry. That's a very distinctive characteristic of Hebrew narrative. And we have a chapter in the book Coming to Grips with Genesis, 14 scholars, all theologians, defending the young earth creationist view from a theological, biblical, and historical perspective. And one of the chapters is all about that imperfect verb form in Genesis 1. And Dr. Stephen Boyd, who's a Hebrew scholar, compares Genesis 1 to 40 poetic texts in the Old Testament that nobody disagrees is poetic, and 40 narrative texts in the Old Testament that nobody disagrees is Hebrew narrative, historical narrative. And he shows that Genesis 1, on the basis of a very detailed statistical analysis of the verbs, that it is 99.999% certain that Genesis 1 is historical narrative. Well, let's go on and look at some more evidence. Not only does the second sentence structure indicate this, but there's a lack of poetic features in Genesis 1 and in the rest of Genesis 1 to 11, except for that moment after Eve was created when Adam became very poetic. And all the men would know that if you woke up after a dream and saw a beautiful woman, you'd be poetic at that moment also. But the most important characteristic of Hebrew poetry is parallelism. I'll just give you a couple of examples. In Psalm 92, verses 1 and 2, "It is good to give thanks to the Lord, to sing praises to your name, O Most High." The first half of the verse is repeated in the second half with a parallel idea. Sometimes the parallelism is synonymous, so the first half of the verse is repeated in synonymous words. Sometimes it's the opposite for contrast, but that's a parallelism. To declare your loving kindness in the morning and your faithfulness by night. The second part of the verse doesn't repeat the to declare part, but that's assumed in the context, and so you have that parallelism. In Psalm 136, you have a different kind of parallelism. "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his loving kindness is everlasting. Give thanks to the God of gods." Now you have the first verse is repeating the same idea in the second verse, in the first parts of both verses, and then you have the repeated refrain running through the whole psalm. So these kinds of parallelisms are very common in Hebrew poetry. They don't exist in Genesis 1 to 11. It's historical narrative. It's not poetry. But then some say, particularly in the framework hypothesis view, that there is a sort of parallelism. If we look at the text, we see that on days 1, 2, and 3, God created the environments for creatures, and then on day 4, 5, and 6, he filled those environments with creatures. So it's a beautiful parallelism, the framework hypothesis people say. On day 1, God creates the heavens. On day 4, he fills the heavens. On day 2, God creates the water in the sky. And on day 5, he fills the water in the sky with birds and fish. And then on day 3, he creates the dry land and plants. And then on day 6, he fills the dry land with animals. It's a beautiful parallelism, unless you look at the details. And then it's not so nice and tidy. Let's look at a couple of details. On day 2, it was not the sky that was created, it was the expanse. The Hebrew word there is rakia. And the rakia was made on day 2 to separate the waters below from the waters above. When we come to day 4, we are told 3 times that God made the sun, moon, and stars in the rakia. And verse 17 says God placed them in the rakia. So the sun, moon, and stars were not created to fill something that was created on verse 1. They were created to fill something that was made on day 2. So it's not a nice parallelism. Then as far as the fish, the water was made on day 1, but seas, the specific word seas, was not made until day 3. But the fish, it said very clearly on day 5 that the fish filled the waters of the seas. So the fish didn't fill something that was made on day 2, they filled something that was made on day 3. And then we note that on day 6, nothing was made to fill the seas that were made on day 3. So it's not a nice, neat parallelism. It breaks down. You know, we sometimes say the devil is in the details. In this case, it's the Lord who is in the details. It's the devil who is in the superficialities. And we have a chapter in Coming to Grips dealing with the framework hypothesis, a very thorough analysis and refutation by an Old Testament scholar. Not only do we have the lack of parallelism in the poetic, in the Genesis narrative, we also lack figurative language. In Hebrew poetry, there's a lot of figurative language. So we read things like, "The Lord is my rock. The Lord is my fortress." Well, God isn't literally a rock. He's not literally a building. That's figurative language. We don't have that kind of language in Genesis 1 through 11. A very common word in Hebrew poetry is the word like or as. That doesn't appear in Genesis 1 to 11. Then we have in Hebrew poetry sound technique.